I had no alternative but to order the regiment in. We had no force on hand to meet the sudden emergency. Troops had been ordered up and were coming on the run, but I saw that in some way 5 minutes must be gained or we were lost. It was fortunate that I found there so grand a body of men as the 1st Minnesota. I knew they must lose heavily, and it caused me pain to give the order for them to advance, but I would have done it even if I had known every man would be killed. It was a sacrifice that must be made. The superb gallantry of those men saved our line from being broken. General Winfield Scott Hancock.
Just as the sun comes up out here this morning in Gettysburg, we're out at the site of the 1st Minnesota so that we can tell the story of the 1st Minnesota and one of the soldiers that fought out here at Gettysburg and was wounded. We're also going to try to peel back that story a little bit because it doesn't quite unfold the way a lot of people like to tell it. Minnesota's not the only group out here that's helping in this position. They're just the ones that got the credit because it's a very dramatic story. And that's what people like. They like the drama. Those are the kind of stories I like to talk about. So hopefully we shed some light and bring something new to you here, Gettysburg. Before we can dispel any of the rumors or talk to any of the other action that happened out here on the field with the 1st Minnesota, we'll get into talking about a soldier that was a part of that unit. And then we'll go into a little bit more detail as to what exactly unfolded out here with the 1st Minnesota and how they ended up being involved in the way that they were. The slaughter that happened with that unit, the amount of casualties, quite frankly, was just a result of a mismatch between the sides of units. They ran headlong into the Alabamians out here on this field. There's no doubt in that. Everybody reported that. And Hancock himself knew that he was sending that unit to slaughter. He said so much. But the story that's here is about the individuals that make up the 262. And we'll talk about one of those individuals who got wounded almost immediately once he started going into the fight. Orderly Sergeant Matthew Marvin from Winona joins a war effort in 1861. He ends up being wounded twice in combat. The first time he gets wounded happens at the Battle of Bull Run. The second time is in the Peninsula Campaign. He's then wounded a subsequent third time because one of his fellow soldiers accidentally shoots him in the thigh. So the man's not been very lucky. But he heals up. He's out here on these fields in Gettysburg. and the 1st Minnesota are in the field directly behind me there. They're down on the ground, kind of waiting to get into the action. And Hancock's out here, and he starts to see the gap across the field here. Realizes Alabama's about to push through, and that once they get through and push through, they are going to split his line and create a major problem. Hancock rides up, and according to what most people say, asks Minnesota if they see those flags. And they reply, yes, they do. And Hancock says, well, then go take them. And Minnesota, with a yell, streams across this field in a fury to take those flags. 262 men versus a brigade. Now, if you know anything about the sizes of units, then you know how much of a mismatch that is. Brigade's a very large mass of men. 262 men, it's not a lot. They're not going to do a whole lot against that brigade. But what they are going to do is they're going to buy time. Precious time, so that more men can be maneuvered around. And they do that successfully. But they do so at the cost of their own men. Because barely over 40 men make it out of that fight without something severe happening to them. That's an 80% casualty rate here on this field. Marvin's one of them. In order to better understand the story out here, we have to be in this position to show you where everything is. So Minnesota's down there. Across this field's where Alabama's going to be coming from. The reason why they're in the pickle that they're in right now in the first place is because of Dan Sickles. Down there in that position is Dan Sickles' headquarters. Dan Sickles' men are supposed to be lined up down this way here, towards Little Round Top, to protect that flank, to be the end of the line. Instead, his men are pushed out here towards the Sherfy Peach Orchard. There is a high ridge over there, just beyond the trees, that he's considered to be extremely important. So he has his men out there at a salient. And in order to support Dan Sickles, Humphreys has to be removed from this position here and positioned at the wheat field, because the fight back there is about to turn for the worse. Because of that, there is now a gap in the line here, and Alabama's about to pour through that gap. Hancock, being the good soldier he is on horseback, is riding around out here and paying attention to all points. And he can see what's unfolding in front of him. That's when he runs up to Minnesota and he asks them to get into the fight. But what that ignores is, for example, Lieutenant Colonel Freeman McGilvery. His battery was masked from retiring cannons from Sickles' front near the Peach Orchard. And they covered the withdrawal of Humphrey's men, establishing his guns on a shelf on a high ground about halfway between the Trossel Farm and the crest of Cemetery Ridge. So the type of firepower that they were getting from him also assisted in the situation to keep the Alabamians back. You had other units that were out here helping to keep the Alabamians back from this position. The 5th U.S. Artillery was definitely one of the main reasons why Alabama didn't come all the way across that field and just run over top the 262 men of Minnesota. So that gives you a little bit of an idea. So now there's time for some battlefield orientation here, everybody's favorite. I'll put the map up on the screen after I'm done talking about the positioning, and then I'll run through it a second time. So off out in my front here, Plum Run runs down through here in this position. And we'll go over there and get some film of that too to add to the video so you can see Plum Run. But Plum Run's running down through there. And coming up through Plum Run is the 17th Mississippi, starting off in this direction over here. 17th Mississippi, the 13th Mississippi, the 18th Mississippi. Falling further into the back out there, we're looking at the 8th Alabama, then the 10th Alabama, setting up shop over here, followed by the 11th Alabama, 14th, and the 9th Alabama. And their positions are running along this area over here, directly out in front of where 1st Minnesota goes into the fight. Back here, if you listen to the story word for word, it makes it sound like this entire field is empty, and the only people here to save the day is the 1st Minnesota. Simply not true. The 125th New York, 126th New York, and the 111th New York are actually out here on this field, and they're fighting in the direction of the 18th, 13th, and 17th Mississippi. They're also supporting the fight against the 8th Alabama and the 10th Alabama. So there's a small gap there between the 111th and the 1st Minnesota. That small gap is where the 10th Alabama, 11th, and the 14th decide that they're going to try to get through that gap and break the lines. And when we're talking about the gap, we're talking about this football field space that's in between here, as Alabama's coming across these fields. Now, just imagine you're one of the soldiers out here on this field, and you're with Minnesota. You know how small your unit is, and you know what you're capable of. Especially Marvin, he's been around for a long time. He's been with Minnesota for a while, and he's been in most of the conflicts out here in the Eastern Theater. Look across that field behind me there. Today, it's kind of hard to imagine. There's cars running up and down the street, cars running up and down this field in my front. And no one can really imagine the amount of men that would have been coming across this field. The battle lines are drawn behind us. It's a long, stretched out line of infantry. The Alabamians are coming on strong. They're ready. They're going to get to this position and break this line if they can. You're standing here as a soldier, and you hear that rebel yell pouring across this field as those men are making their way over here. Put yourself in that man's position. That Minnesotan is probably feeling very anxious at the least. At the worst, the fear is in his guts, and he doesn't know if he's going to live or die. So now Marvin and his men let out a yell, and they're about to charge across this field towards Alabama into certain death. At least that's what one of them said. They knew that they were headed towards death. Just as Marvin starts to run, somehow a bullet drives across the field low enough that it hits him in the front of his foot, and it goes through his large toe, down the bottom of the foot, and blasts out the back of his heel. It takes off a huge portion of his shoe and the heel of his shoe. He falls to the ground and looks at his foot, and he sees that big chunk of leather missing, and then the blood is just oozing out of his boot. Well, looking up, realizing that his men have just left him behind, he wanted to catch up with them and be a part of the fight. So he gets on his feet, even though he's badly wounded, and he tries to run to catch up to them. And he gets to right about where they're at and is trying to get into the fight. But then the blood loss, the excitement of the moment, causes him to black out, and he falls down flat on his face. Now, while the fighting and the melee is happening all around him, and the 1st Minnesota is pushed out even further from where they're at when he was on the ground, he rolls over on his back, he grabs his canteen, and he takes himself a big drink of water. And he looks up at the position behind me here, across those fields, and sees the fight. And he realizes he can't get out there anymore. He's not well enough to do it. So he rolls back over on his stomach, gets to his feet, and he tries to walk back across that field directly behind me to get back over here to the main lines. He gets a little bit into the walk, and then he falls down again, and he realizes he's not going to make it. He crawls across this ground to where I'm at, over here on this side, and gets back to safety on his main line. That wound stops him from fighting, and it pretty much effectively ends his fight during the American Civil War. He would not be able to fight anymore. He's too badly wounded. In this war, there are really a couple things you need. You need to be able to pull the trigger, you need to be able to walk, and you have to have at least 2 teeth to bite the end of a cartridge so that you could pour the powder down the end of that barrel. Well, he doesn't have his feet anymore. He's badly wounded as a result of the fight here at Gettysburg. Can you hear the sound of the guns out here on these fields when you walk these fields? Imagine the fight all around you. That's the kind of thing that inspires me out here. To know that these men standing these lines, realizing that they may not get to go back home to their children, to their wives, to their mothers and fathers, and being so young, their future, it could end in a moment at any field, and they wouldn't know if that would end in victory or if that would end in defeat. The only thing that they had was hope. I'm now headed into the position of Minnesota right now, where their statue is. So Marvin ends up discharged June of 1864 because of his injury. And he's married to a woman named Angeline. He has a couple of kids, and he goes on to be a superintendent of a cemetery in Winona. That same cemetery today is where he's buried. and Winona. He was a fighting man out here with Minnesota. Minnesota sent 262 of their best into the fight. And out of that 262, 215 of them would be casualties. Casualty rate of over 80%. And that's the story of Marvin out here in Gettysburg. For all of Marvin's efforts and the rest of Minnesota, everything turns out okay. The fight out here unfolds exactly the way the generals really planned on the Union side. They defended their territory, even though they gave up some of their ground on July 2nd. And they were able to stop the Confederates from completely rolling up their lines. Coming across these fields, Alabama was on a tear. So was Mississippi. Mississippi, specifically the 13th, had pushed Dan Sickles' men over a half a mile from their positions, originally over on the Peach Orchard. Alabama was coming across that Emmitsburg Road and making a run for it over here. It was amazing what was going on at that time. And without groups, units, like Minnesota, the line surely would have been split in half. And the Confederates could have fought on the flank of either position here at Cemetery Hill. And once one portion of that line breaks, that's the end of it. They have to reposition and move again. And who knows, Gettysburg on July 2nd may have turned into the Confederate victory that Robert E. Lee was looking for. But Marvin and Minnesota made sure that didn't happen. As I walk over here to Father Corby to get my blessing as I'm wrapping up my videos here at Gettysburg for the series, I can't help but think of these monuments and the positions around these fields as more than just position markers. When you go to a cemetery, there are monuments all over the place. Those monuments are individual monuments to the people and the lives that they lived. They can't put their entire lives on one stone tablet. All they can do is put their dates of living and a few kind words for the individual that it was dedicated to. These monuments here packed as much information on it as it possibly could, and they're dedicated to the people that fought here and to the people that died here. This is their cemetery. Earlier we said we were going to put the map back up on the screen so that you can kind of take a look at what we were talking about here on the field. In front of us with Minnesota. So that's a Minnesota monument right over there with a man standing on top running or charging towards the field. And they're headed out generally in this direction over here. Right out where this bramble and bushes and all that stuff is over there. Now, we're in a different position than we were last time, so this is going to line up a little bit better for you. So I'll go ahead and put that map up on the screen now. The 9th Alabama, starting from the right, the 9th Alabama, the 14th Alabama, the 11th Alabama, and the 10th Alabama is under Wilcox. And you can see that they're in front of Plum Run. You see the jetted out trees there. So that's what we're looking at, right? Going directly behind that, you can see the 8th Alabama moving on to the left. And beside that, the 18th Mississippi, 13th Mississippi, and the 17th Mississippi, all under William Barksdale. They are facing, if you look back towards the Union side on the left-hand side, the 125th New York, the 126th New York, 111th New York. Then there's a gap in between, and that's where you see the 1st Minnesota on this map. Now, this map comes directly out of a field guide to Gettysburg. And we will take the map off the screen now so that you can see the positions. So starting with the 9th Alabama, we're working from this direction over. This is what we're talking about here. And then off in this direction over here is where Mississippi is coming from. Right out in that direction there. We're on Cemetery Ridge, where New York is supporting off in this direction here. Then there's a gap that's in between. As you can see, New York would be out in here. And the gap is in between here, leading up to Minnesota. Minnesota is trying to plug this very large gap here and slow down the men that are coming across this field. And the artillery pieces that are over here are also plugging the gap as well. And they are firing upon the men as they're coming across this wide open field. It was a bloody affair out here for sure. Now, I'm no expert out here at the Battle of Gettysburg. I'm probably just like you. I've read enough on it, studied enough on it, love the place. I come out here often, and I learn something new every time, like Minnesota. In studying this, I learned a little bit more about the fight here and the support that they had going into this fight, and that it wasn't just Minnesota winning the day. But if you really want to get a feel for everything out here, I highly suggest that you go get a tour from one of the professional guides at the National Park station. Hire one of those guides, certified and licensed. They know this field like the back of their hand. They have many programs built, and they can tell you these stories out here with a lot more accuracy and a lot more detail than what I can give you with these videos. I use them often myself in helping me come up with the plans for these videos. They lay the blueprint, and I just follow it. Go check them out. Well, just like all good things must come to an end, so must this trip here at Gettysburg. I've had a great time out here telling these stories of these soldiers on these fields. And within a 24-hour period, I've managed to put in a lot of work. So I have a lot of good stories coming up for you here on the channel. I hope you take something from these videos, and it gives you more to see the next time you come out here at Gettysburg. And when you get out here, tell those stories to other people. Pass them along so that they know about Marvin and the 1st Minnesota and the other soldiers that we talk about out here on these fields. It's been great. Until next time, it's History with Waffles.
With his hopes for a successful invasion of the North shattered, Lee awaited a Union counterattack on July 4th, which never materialized. That night, amid heavy rain, the Confederate general retreated with his battered army toward Virginia. The Union emerged victorious at Gettysburg. Although Meade faced criticism for not pursuing Lee after the battle, Gettysburg represented a devastating defeat for the Confederacy. Union casualties reached 23,000, while the Confederates suffered approximately 28,000 losses, over a third of Lee's forces. The North celebrated, while the South mourned, its aspirations for foreign recognition of the Confederacy dashed.